Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. As you are busy with year end and increased volumes of vendor ads and changes, really any time of the year, you may be ready to reduce your vendor process activities by outsourcing your vendor payments next year or whenever, with a bonus of reducing payment fraud risk. How? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 366, Reduce Payment Fraud Risk by Outsourcing Your Vendor Payments. Now, I didn't realize it was this far back or, a couple of years ago, really over that, because January 2023 is when I originally posted the podcast episode. But so that's almost 3 years ago. But it was episode 219, and I had Mark Pensarini, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, on outsourcing your vendor payments, and another outsourcing that I agree with. Do you? And so if you haven't listened to that episode, go ahead and listen to it, because he does talk about some things that his company does. With their clients for outsourcing vendor payments, and he gives a very compelling argument. And the reason I had him on my podcast in the first place is because he was on a panel at a conference, in-person conference I was attending, and I was like, he just resonated with me completely because, and you'll see, outsourcing your vendor payments has a direct impact on reducing activity in the vendor process and also reducing the potential for payment fraud. So let's just go ahead and jump into it. So first of all, I want to go through and I want to talk first about the risk of fraudulent payments with in-house vendor payments, and then I'll talk about how to reduce the risk, or how you can reduce the risk of fraudulent payments by outsourcing your vendor payments. And I'll talk about 4 benefits of outsourcing the vendor payments, and also what outsourcing vendor payments won't do for you. So, nothing can be 100%. So let's go ahead and get started with the risk of fraudulent payments with in-house vendor payments. And now, most of you know that I used to be an AP senior manager over global vendor setup and maintenance, maintained 140,000 active vendors across 7,000, seemed like it at some point, 7 different ERPs. But for 3 of those years that I was in that position, I also handled all payments that went out the door. Now imagine that, if a payment file failed, and, those of you that manage payments, you know what I'm talking about. That can be a little traumatic. But if it failed because one of the vendor team members didn't put in, I don't know, that additional, 0 or a digit in front of the digit routing number, Canadian routing number, because the vendor didn't know to add that extra 0 and the whole payment file failed. Then I had one team that was completely mad about my other team. So that wasn't nice to be in the middle of that. But anyway, I was over payments. And so uh, I do know a bit about it, but let's talk about the things that can happen, those moving pieces, right, of the process. And so to get to that payment. So the first thing, and I've got four things, right? So the first thing is you definitely have to collect the vendor remittance details. And often that process involves collecting vendor remittance details via risky email. I'm not sure if you guys are still doing that or not, but if you are, do not feel bad because lots of folks are still in that position. So you're collecting it via risky emails. Team members collecting this information are expected to immediately recognize red flags of fraud, and accessible validations are performed to ensure the information is accurate and that the remittance information does belong to the vendors. And there can be all types of fails at each one of those stages, especially immediately recognizing red flags in an email, because nowadays with AI, fraudsters know how to send very legitimate looking emails. And now that they have, because there have been so many data breaches, right, the actual login information for email inboxes, they could send an email right from your vendor's inbox, and it could sound very legitimate, and so it's very hard to catch. So, in any event, you are collecting vendor remittance details from potentially risky email, and then you're storing those vendor remittance details in the system. So you're storing those vendor bank details for electronic payments or the remittance address for check payments right in the system. And then once the invoices are posted and the payment terms align with your next pay file, the remittance details are going to be pulled in the system pay files because the pay cycles are going to be run, and separate pay files will generate based on payment type and pull in the remittance details from the vendor record to be included in the pay files. And then the last step of that is you're going to pay your vendors. So once the pay cycles are generated and released, to be sent to the bank for electronic payments or to be sent to the printer to have the checks printed for your check payment method vendors. Now, the problem with this process, if I haven't already said, is that the collection of the vendor remittance details is risky. Furthermore, storing that information in the vendor master file means that there is a risk of not only external fraud from requiring team members to collect this information so that they can update it when needed, and it could be a fraudulent update, but also from internal team members looking to change the vendor remittance information to their own information, just right before the pay cycle. So, how can these two problems be solved? And one answer: outsourcing your vendor payments. Now, outsourcing your vendor payments comes with four benefits, and you really, again, reduce the risk of fraudulent payments. So, in general, outsourcing your vendor payments means that payment information will be sent to the third party payment provider who will work with the vendor to identify a payment method and remit that payment on your company's behalf. Now, third party providers who will pay your vendors, right, will perform this service. They can differ on the point that they enable a new vendor on their platform. For some, new vendors are enrolled based on being added to your vendor master file. They'll get an automated file or a batch file sent over. However, that particular third party gets that information, while others may wait until that new vendor is included on a pay file for their first payment, because the pay file will be run and it will be for the most part, pay files are run just as normal by the system, but instead of pulling in remittance details and sending it to the bank or sending it to the printer, they're just going to send that pay file to that third party provider that you've outsourced your payments to, and then they will handle making the payments to the vendors. Now, and when I say making payments to the vendors, I also mean, like I said before, working with the vendor to, if they are new to the platform, to identify their payment method. All right, now here are 4 benefits of outsourcing vendor payments. So the first one is you avoid collecting vendor remittance information. So can I say that again? You avoid collecting vendor remittance information. So if vendor remittance information does not have to be stored on a vendor record, then that means the team member does not have to process that remittance details change request that came through the email that could or could not be or may not be fraudulent. You just forward that email to the third-party payment solution provider to handle. Isn't that just great? You don't even have to worry about it. Also, you avoid storing vendor remittance information. So when vendor remittance information is not stored in the system, there's no chance to expose vendor sensitive information to any team members who could be social engineered into revealing that information. And think about this: how many team members in your organization actually have access to view the entire vendor record? It happens more often than you think. And so that sensitive information that, could be a tax ID, social security number, could be the tax ID if they're individual, sole proprietor, single member LLC. Also, it could be right, the banking information that they will be able to see. And again, they could be social engineered out of that information. So if you know that your system is not locked down as far as who has access and even masking sensitive data, this is good for you too. Now, again, because pay cycles are no longer being generated, the system is not pulling remittance information that could be changed by a team member, right, engaging in internal fraud. And so you don't have to collect it and you don't have to store it. So now when you're collecting required documents for your vendor setup, you no longer have to collect the banking information. You might still have to collect the remittance address if that is the only address for the vendor. But imagine not having to worry about whether this bank account belongs to the vendor, whether that email request to change the bank account is fraudulent or not. All right, so that's great. So the third benefit is potential fraud liability coverage. So in the event that there is a fraudulent payment, depending on the third party provider and the type of payment method for the vendor, the liability or risk payment loss is covered. And from my experience in speaking with different outsourcing providers, also speaking with Mark Pensarini on episode 219, depending on the type of payment, especially if they pay with a card, then that liability can be covered by the card. And they do try to, just so you know, and you probably already know this, right? Many of the outsourcing providers try to get the vendors to accept payment via card, because then they earn rebates off of that. But that's great for you too, especially if by having that card payment method, it gives you liability coverage if it is a fraudulent payment. Now, the fourth benefit is enhanced security. So consider the third party provider as a professional in vendor setup and maintenance. Not only do some invest heavily in state of the art security measures to protect against fraud, but in the selection process, they confirm that the vendor enrollments team is trained in the latest techniques to avoid fraud and that they have advanced encryption techniques, multi-factor authentication, and real-time monitoring to detect and prevent unauthorized transactions. Now, if any of you out there can say your teams or your company or your departments have that, then you know what? You might want to just keep it in house. But I'm going to bet that you don't have all of that. It doesn't mean that all of the third party providers have all of the things. You definitely need to do your due diligence. But if you are still accepting and communicating with vendors via risky email. And by accepting, I mean accepting vendor onboarding documents or setup documents via risky email. You might want to give outsourcing a try, or at least see if you can talk to leadership about looking into third party providers uh, that handle your vendor payments. But before you do that, here are two things that outsourcing vendor payments won't do. So it won't avoid setup of the vendor record, but you probably already knew that because vendors will still need to have a vendor record just without the remittance details. Vendor records are still required to generate purchase orders, track payment activity, post invoices to, and other tasks in the financial operations. Also, it will not, and you might have thought that this was going to be true, but I'm just going to burst that bubble. It will not decrease your turnaround time for vendor setup. So, outsourcing your vendor payments won't speed up your vendor setup and onboarding process. It may even increase it. Payment providers can have a long turnaround time to enroll new vendors, especially to change existing vendors. Expect a turnaround time of 10 to 15 days. Now, if you think about it, right, they are the professionals in onboarding, right, vendors in collecting remittance details, and they definitely want to make sure that they avoid fraud because if they have fraud, right, they lose clients, especially if they are not covered or don't have that coverage of the transferring the fraud liability, right? And so they definitely want to make sure that that vendor bank change, for example, is valid. And you might want to take a hint from that turnaround time because I know when I was a practitioner, this was what, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, we had a turnaround time of 24 to 48 hours to process vendor setup requests. I would never do that today because we have additional validations, additional internal controls, authentication, best practices, vendor validations, right, in order to prevent fraud. And you can't do all of that in 24 to 48 hours, especially if some of those controls involve communicating back with the vendor, such as that confirmation call. That may uh, definitely push it over that, original turnaround time that we used to use of 24 to 48 hours. All right. So I hope this helped you understand what you need to look at, what the benefits can be, right, for outsourcing your vendor payments. And don't forget to go back and listen to episode 219 if you haven't already with Mark Pensarini from a third party payment solution provider who does right handle clients that outsource their payments. All right, so thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 366th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.